The prophet stands in the crowded, dust-choked marketplace of Jerusalem. The year is late in the history of a dying kingdom, damp crevice of a jagged rock. And then, he is told to turn his back and walk away, to the one wearing it, simply by remaining attached. The fabric does not have to perform. It does not have to strive. It just has to stay close. Its entire identity and value are derived from its proximity to the body. If that is the original design, it fundamentally changes how we must understand human failure. If their primary purpose was intimate connection, what exactly constitutes their sin in this passage? We tend to define sin as a list of broken rules, a failure to perform religious rituals, or a lapse in moral judgment. But the architecture of the linen belt redefines the crisis. Sin, at its core, is the tragic unbinding of the soul from the God who made it. It is the delusion that we can survive without the warmth of His presence. The garment is useless if it refuses to cling. God did not simply announce this unbinding. He forced Jeremiah to physically enact it. The tragedy of the narrative is about to accelerate, because the prophet's bizarre errand is not yet finished. He is still standing by the waters of the Euphrates, holding a piece of linen. The true devastation occurs when the garment is finally removed from the waist. The prophet stands at the edge of the river. The moment has come. He reaches down and unwraps the ephod from his waist. As the fabric pulls away from his skin, the physical connection is broken. He finds a dark, jagged crevice in the rocks near the water. When we read this account in the 13th chapter of Jeremiah, it is easy to reduce it to a simple, slightly bizarre object lesson. He pushes the linen deep into the cold, damp stone, turns his back, and begins the long, exhausting walk back to Jerusalem. And then, nothing happens. The biblical text simply says, "Many days passed." Imagine the silent, invisible process occurring inside that rocky tomb. The linen, which was explicitly designed to be kept dry and close to the heat of a living, breathing body, is now abandoned to the elements. Moisture from the river creeps into the fine threads. The cold dirt settles into the weave. Mildew and mold begin to spread without the warmth of the waist to protect it. The fabric slowly breaks down in the darkness, fraying and deteriorating in its damp isolation. Why does God subject His own sacred garment to this miserable end? God breaks the silence and gives Jeremiah the interpretation. "In the same way I will ruin the pride of Judah and the great pride of Jerusalem." When we hear the word pride, we usually picture a boastful king on a throne, a wealthy merchant flaunting his riches, or an arrogant politician making grand speeches. We define pride as thinking too highly of ourselves. We think of it as an inflated ego, but the metaphor of the linen undergarment redefines the concept completely. In this physical sermon, pride is not allowed. Public boast. Pride is an act of detachment. Pride is the garment believing it no longer needs the waist. Most readers assume this is just a standard ancient metaphor about how sin makes a person dirty or unacceptable to God. The people of Judah had convinced themselves they were secure. They had the grand architecture of the temple. They had the fortified walls of Jerusalem. They had clever political alliances with Egypt to protect them from Babylon. Over generations, they had replaced an intimate, clinging relationship with God with a hollow system of religious rituals and geopolitical strategies. They had untied themselves from His presence and hidden themselves in the hard rocks of their own independence. But the terrifying truth of the ephod is what happens next. The linen did not rot because someone actively attacked it with a knife or burned it with fire. It did not rot because it was inherently flawed from the beginning. The linen rotted simply because it was left alone. This alters how we must understand spiritual corruption. We often think of corruption as the sudden presence of a dark, aggressive evil invading our lives. But Jeremiah's belt reveals that spiritual corruption is actually the absence of life. It is the natural, inevitable consequence of isolation. A soul that detaches from the God who made it does not become strong and free. It becomes dangerously fragile. When we remove ourselves from the presence of God to hide in the rocks of our own making, we do not evolve. We unravel. Separation is decay. For many days, the fabric remains buried in the stone. We treat it as a moralistic equation. A soiled belt represents a soiled nation. The problem is not that this familiar interpretation is entirely wrong. The people of Judah continue their busy lives in the city, entirely unaware that their spiritual condition is being mirrored by a rotting cloth hundreds of miles away. But the visual prophecy is not yet complete. The prophet cannot stay in Jerusalem. Eventually, the voice of God speaks to Jeremiah again. He is ordered to retrace his steps, cross the massive, dangerous distance a second time, and return to the riverbank, to dig the garment out. When the rock is finally opened, the inevitable consequence is revealed. Jeremiah arrives at the edge of the river a second time. The 400-mile journey has worn him down again, his sandals coated in the dust of a foreign empire. He searches the riverbank until he finds the exact rock, the jagged tomb where he left the linen undergarment many days before. He reaches into the dark, damp stone and pulls the fabric out. It is no longer a pristine, expensive, priestly garment. It is a deteriorating rag. The linen is stiff with dirt, weakened by moisture, and eaten away by mildew. It literally falls apart in his hands. The prophet records the moment in a single, devastating sentence. So I went to Perath and dug up the belt and took it from the place where I had hidden it. The problem is that we stop reading too early, flattening the profound emotional weight of the text. If God merely wanted to communicate, but now it was ruined and completely useless. Completely useless. Those two words form the terrifying climax of the visual prophecy. To understand their weight, we have to recognize how differently God and humanity define a wasted life. When we think of someone or something becoming useless, we evaluate it through the lens of productivity. We measure usefulness by skills, achievements, economic value, and measurable output. In the ancient world, a nation was considered useful if it had a strong military, thriving trade routes, and impenetrable architecture. By every human metric, the city of Jerusalem still looked entirely useful. The markets were fully operational. The politicians were negotiating treaties, and the temple choirs were still singing their daily psalms. But God does not measure human usefulness by productivity. He measures it by proximity. Remember the original design of the Ezor. The undergarment was not designed to fight battles. It was not designed to build walls, harvest wheat, or negotiate peace. Its sole function was to cling tightly to the waist of its owner. It was meant to absorb his warmth, move with his body, and be a private, intimate possession. Therefore, the moment the belt is removed from the waist, it immediately loses its entire reason for existing, even before it rots in the rocks. A disconnected belt serves no function. That Jerusalem had become morally corrupt. A prophet could have simply dropped a piece of cloth in the mud. This exposes the deepest tragedy of human rebellion. We often treat sin merely as bad behavior. We view it as a violation of a moral code that must be punished. But the ruined linen reveals that sin is much worse than a broken rule. Sin is the tragic loss of purpose. When the people of Judah detached themselves from the intimacy of God, they did not just become immoral. They became an empty shell. They were supposed to be a kingdom of priests, wrapped around the Creator to display His character to the surrounding nations. But an unattached belt cannot display the glory of the one who is no longer wearing it. It is good for nothing. The coming judgment of exile was not simply God acting out in a sudden burst of temper. It was a heartbroken Creator acknowledging the reality that His people had already chosen. They wanted to exist apart from Him, and He was finally handing them over to the damp, dark isolation they preferred. He was letting the fabric experience the natural, decaying result of its own detachment. It is easy to look back at the people of Jerusalem and judge their foolishness. We can clearly see the madness of leaving the waste of God to hide in the rocks of Babylon. But this ancient visual sermon was not just a historical warning. He could have tossed it into a fire or torn it into shreds in the temple courtyard. But the instructions are painfully specific for a doomed city in the 6th century BC. The pattern of the rotting belt did not stop at the Euphrates River. It is playing out right now. And this is where the prophet's bizarre errand becomes a terrifying mirror for our own lives. The image of the ruined, unwearable linen lying in the dirt of a foreign river is not just a piece of ancient history, it is an exact diagnosis of the human condition today. The terrible question this passage asks is not whether you are making mistakes. The question is, where are you hiding in the rocks? We live in a world that worships autonomy. We are constantly told that true freedom means cutting ties, depending on no one, and building a life entirely on our own strength. We treat God the way the people of Judah did, as a distant emergency contact, or a cold system of principles to manage our morality. But when the pressure rises, when the fear of failure or the desire for control takes over, our instinct is to unbind ourselves from His waist. We pull away to hide in the crevices of our own making. We hide in our careers, hoping our achievements will give us a secure identity. We hide in our relationships, demanding that other people provide the unconditional warmth that only God can offer. God demands that the fabric be worn intimately against the prophet's body. He explicitly forbids the use of water to clean or preserve it. We hide in our anxieties, obsessively trying to manage every outcome because we no longer trust the one we were supposed to cling to. We mistake our independence for safety, but the architecture of the soul cannot be cheated. Perhaps you have felt it. You feel a slow, quiet unraveling in your spirit. The joy fades. The anxiety hardens into a constant, low-level dread. Your faith feels brittle, like fabric that has lost its elasticity. You find yourself spiritually exhausted, running on empty, unable to maintain the religious performance you once managed so easily. When we experience this spiritual dryness, we often assume God is actively punishing us. We think He is angry because we failed to keep a moral rule. So He is deliberately withdrawing His blessing to teach us a lesson. But the ruined belt reveals a much more heartbreaking reality. The exhaustion you feel, the spiritual dryness, the fraying edges of your peace. This is not an arbitrary punishment. It is simply the natural consequence of trying to survive, apart from the one you were made to cling to. A linen undergarment cannot survive the damp and the cold on its own. It has no internal source of heat. It was designed to absorb the life of its wearer. In the exact same way, you were not created to generate your own spiritual life. And then, He requires a massive geographical relocation, simply to abandon it in a stone tomb. The tragedy of the linen belt. You were not built to sustain yourself in the harsh elements of a broken world. When you pull away from the profound, intimate presence of God, your soul slowly frays. It happens not because God is attacking you, but because you have left the only environment where you can actually survive. The crisis is not your behavior. The crisis is your distance. This creates a devastating realization. If you look at the fraying edges of your own life and recognize that you have been hiding in the rocks, what happens next? Jeremiah's belt was ruined. The text says it was completely useless. When an ancient garment reached that stage of decay, it was thrown away. It could not be washed. It could not be rewoven. The damage was permanent. If this visual prophecy is a mirror for our own spiritual decay, the natural conclusion is terrifying. If we are the ruined linen, does God simply discard the fabric? Is there any hope for restoration once the intimacy has been severely damaged? The story of the ruined belt does not end in the mud of the Euphrates. Look back at the entire architecture of this ancient visual prophecy. The profound meaning of Jeremiah's bizarre errand compresses into three devastating truths. First, you were designed for an intimate, clinging closeness to your Creator. Second, your pride drove you to seek safety in the cold rocks of your own independence. Is not just that it becomes soiled. The true tragedy is the specific intimacy of the garment, the deliberate command not to wash it. And third, that deliberate separation is the exact mechanism that causes your soul to decay. Under the Old Covenant, the physical linen belt that Jeremiah buried was completely ruined. It could not be salvaged. It was discarded in the dirt of a foreign empire. But God's plan for humanity did not end with a discarded garment. Centuries after Jeremiah walked the long, dusty road to Babylon, God initiated a final, permanent reversal of the tragedy. If the fabric of humanity was too ruined to save itself, the owner would have to cross the distance to retrieve it. Jesus Christ is the ultimate answer to the tragedy of the Ezor. He did not remain at a distance. Shouting moral instructions from the safety of heaven, he took on human flesh, wrapping our fragile, fraying humanity tightly around himself. He became the perfect high priest, wearing the linen of our existence, binding himself to us so intimately that the gap between God and man was finally closed. And then, Jesus did something staggering. He allowed himself to be taken into the ultimate exile. He went into the dark, cold crevice of the rock. When he was crucified, they wrapped his lifeless body in linen and placed him inside a stone tomb. For 3 days, it looked as though the ancient pattern of Jeremiah was repeating itself perfectly. The garment of humanity was buried in the rock, sealed in the darkness, and abandoned to the natural elements of death. And the people are ignoring the gathering storm. He pays for a fresh, pristine linen garment, and the fact that its destruction is caused entirely by its separation from its owner. This is not ultimately a story about a ruined piece of clothing, but here, the terrifying mechanism of decay is completely shattered, because Jesus is the very source of life. The damp and the dark could not consume him. The scriptures explicitly declare that the Holy One did not see decay. When the heavy stone was rolled away on Sunday morning, Jesus emerged from the crevice of the rock alive, bringing humanity out of the grave with him. He conquered the exile of sin and death, permanently fastening us to his own resurrected body. He went into the rocks to retrieve what was ruined, and he brought it out transformed. This changes everything about how you must view your own life right now. You are not a discarded piece of clothing. No matter how far you have wandered, no matter how much spiritual dryness you have experienced, or how much you feel like your life is fraying, at the edges, the owner has not abandoned you to the elements. You may feel completely useless because you have measured your worth by your own productivity, your fierce independence, or your rigid moral perfection. But God measures your worth by his willingness to wear you. Your purpose has not changed since the moment you were created. You were not made to survive the cold on your own. You were not built to generate your own strength or manage your own survival. The spiritual exhaustion you feel is simply the weight of trying to be your own source of life, your only job, your highest. It is a story about the tragedy of ruined intimacy. We are comfortable with a God who is angered by broken rules, and most beautiful calling is to stay attached to the one who gives you warmth. The tragedy of the linen belt is completely undone by the cross. This is not ultimately a story about the inevitable decay of a broken people. It is the story of a God who refuses to let you rot in the dark. Come out of the rocks and let him hold you again. If this exploration helped you see Scripture's deep beauty, please consider subscribing and sharing this video with someone who feels far from God today. Your support helps us continue uncovering the true heart of the Bible. We are far less prepared for a God who describes human rebellion as a physical tearing away from his own body. The image of the linen belt tightly clinging to a man's waist is one of the most powerful and heartbreaking pictures of God's love in the entire Old Testament. It reveals what we were actually created for, and it exposes the exact mechanism of how a human soul decays. The corruption does not begin when the fabric gets a little dirt on it. The corruption begins when the fabric is removed from the warmth of the body it was designed to hold. But to understand why this ancient visual sermon is so devastating, we cannot just look at the fabric. We have to follow the prophet out of the city. Why would God demand that a perfectly good linen garment be ruined in such a specific, geographically remote way? The answer lies not in the garment itself, but in the terrifying reality of where Jeremiah was told to bury it. The fabric is clean, woven with care, and expensive. He puts it on, letting it rest directly against his skin. The shadow over Jerusalem is growing longer. It is the late 7th century BC, and a new, terrifying superpower has risen in the east, Babylon. Yet, the streets of Jerusalem are filled with a frantic, fragile optimism. The temple rituals continue without interruption. The priests burn incense, and the politicians negotiate desperate treaties with Egypt. They are absolutely convinced that God will never allow his holy city to fall to a pagan empire. But Jeremiah stands in the tension of knowing the truth. He sees what the people refuse to see. The end is approaching. In the middle of this national delusion, the prophet receives the next phase of his instructions. Take the belt you bought and are wearing around your waist, and go now to Perath and hide it there, in a crevice in the rocks. The name Perath drops like an anvil into the biblical text. This is the Hebrew name for the mighty Euphrates River. To reach the Euphrates from Jerusalem is not a casual afternoon walk. It is a grueling, dangerous journey of nearly 400 miles. Imagine the physical toll. The prophet must leave the familiar, terraced hills of Judah. He must walk for weeks through arid landscapes, feeling the relentless sun on his back and the dust clinging to his feet. And all the while, he is carrying a piece of fabric. But almost immediately, the behavior becomes strange. He is given a strict instruction from God. He must wear this new garment that is already stiff with his own sweat. Scholars continue to debate whether Jeremiah made the literal trek all the way to the heart of Babylon, or if he buried the garment at a local spring with a similar sounding name that symbolized the same terrifying reality. But the prophetic message is unmistakable. Regardless of the exact mileage, the destination is everything. The Euphrates was the lifeblood of the Babylonian Empire. It was the epicenter of their military might and the source of their economic dominance. By commanding Jeremiah to bury the garment in the rocks near this specific river, God is not simply disposing of a piece of clothing. He is performing a funeral. This long, exhausting journey was a physical enactment of a coming national nightmare. God is showing the people of Judah exactly what is about to happen to them. They are going to be violently ripped away from their homeland. They will be dragged across the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the ancient Near East, taken as captives to the waters of Babylon, and abandoned in a foreign land. The journey to the Euphrates was not a random hike to find a hiding spot. It was a prophetic dress rehearsal for the exile. A people who thought they were permanently secure in the presence of God are about to be buried in the rocky crevices of a pagan empire. But he must never let it touch water. For days, perhaps weeks, Jeremiah walks through the relentless heat of the Judean hills. But one detail still refuses to fit. The geography explains the exile, but it does not explain the object itself. If God only wanted to communicate that Judah was going to be conquered and deported, he could have chosen almost anything to make the point. He could have commanded Jeremiah to carry a jar of clay and smash it on the riverbank. He could have had him bury a broken sword, a turned scroll, or a shattered crown. Why choose a piece of linen? The answer is hidden in the original language. To understand the devastating emotional weight of this prophecy, we cannot look at the object through the lens of modern clothing. We have to return to the text and uncover the intimate reality of the exact Hebrew word God used. When we read the 13th chapter of Jeremiah in English, our modern vocabulary slightly betrays the ancient imagery. Standard Bible translations typically describe the object the prophet buys as a linen belt, a waistband, or a sash. When a modern reader hears the word belt, we instantly visualize an accessory. We picture a strip of leather, worn outside our clothing to keep our trousers in place, or a decorative fabric tied around a coat. The linen absorbs his sweat. It gathers the fine, white dust of the city streets. It begins to stiffen and chafe against his waist. It is external. It is functional. But it is ultimately separate from the body itself. But the original Hebrew word shatters that mental image. The specific word God speaks to Jeremiah is ezor. The translation of belt is not entirely wrong, but the English word fails to capture the physical reality of the ancient Near East. In the world of the Old Testament, an ezor was not an outer accessory worn over other clothing. It was an intimate undergarment. It was essentially a linen loincloth. This was the foundational layer of ancient dress. Before a man put on his woven tunic or his heavy outer cloak to face the harsh Judean weather, he wrapped the ezor tightly around his waist and loins. It rested directly against his bare flesh. It was wrapped tight. It was the garment that moved when he moved. It absorbed his sweat in the heat of the day. It carried the warmth of his own body. No piece of clothing was closer, more private, or more physically intimate. This physical detail completely changes how we read the prophetic act. When God wanted to choose a physical object to represent the nation of Judah, he bypassed everything external. He did not choose a royal crown to symbolize their historic authority. He did not choose a bronze shield to represent their military strength, as he delivers his warnings to a people who refuse to listen. And then, just as the physical discomfort becomes a constant companion, he did not choose a golden temple vessel to represent their religious heritage. He chose an ezor. He chose the garment that sits closest to human skin. Imagine the original audience watching Jeremiah walk through the streets of Jerusalem, carrying out this bizarre street theater. He is publicly focusing their attention on an undergarment. It would have been jarring, provocative, and deeply uncomfortable to witness. And that was exactly the point. The shocking nature of the object was meant to wake a spiritually numb city to a staggering reality. God was making a public claim about how close he actually felt to them. The intimacy of the ezor completely rewrites the meaning of the prophecy. We often think of the biblical God as a distant, administrative sovereign. We imagine him ruling from a cold throne in the heavens, demanding rigid moral compliance from miles away. We assume our relationship with him is supposed to be formal and detached. But the linen undergarment destroys that assumption. God did not view his people as subjects in a distant province. He viewed them as an ezor. The problem in Jerusalem was not simply that the people were breaking ancient laws. The problem was that they were tearing themselves away. The command changes. God tells him to take the garment off, leave the city, and walk hundreds of miles across treacherous terrain, from the very skin of God. That would already be a profound realization. But the text does not leave this as a vague metaphor. To understand the full tragedy of the ruined belt, we have to see exactly what this closeness was supposed to produce. Once we see how close the garment was meant to be, the text reveals God's true heart. The physical closeness of the undergarment was not merely a poetic expression of divine affection. It was a statement of architectural design. God did not create his people to function independently, running errands for him across the globe while he watched from afar. He designed them for attachment. We do not have to guess at this meaning, because God explicitly explains the metaphor in the text. In Jeremiah 3:7, the Lord declares, "For as a belt is bound around the waist, so I bound all the people of Israel and all the people of Judah to me, declares the Lord, to be my people for my renown and praise and honor." Notice the verb God uses, bound. He actively pulled them against himself. But there is another hidden detail woven into the fabric itself. Why did God specify that Jeremiah must buy a linen undergarment? In the ancient Near East, everyday workwear for farmers and shepherds was typically made of wool or animal hair. Linen was different. His destination is a specific river. Once there, he is not told to wash it. He is told to shove it into the dark. It was expensive. It was clean. And, in the biblical world, it was profoundly sacred. According to the book of Exodus, linen was the designated fabric of the priesthood. When the priests entered the tabernacle, and when the high priest stepped into the terrifying, unshielded presence of God in the Holy of Holies, he was strictly forbidden from wearing wool, which causes a man to sweat. He was commanded to wear pure, white linen. By choosing a linen ezor, God is layering the imagery. Centuries earlier, at Mount Sinai, God told the Israelites that they would be to him a kingdom of priests. They were meant to be the sacred garment that God wore before the rest of the watching world. When the surrounding pagan nations looked at Israel, they were supposed to see the beauty, the justice, and the character of God, tightly bound to a human community. This is the central contrast of their existence. This is not ultimately a story about achieving moral perfection from a distance. It is a story about maintaining profound, clinging closeness. In the text, God says He bound them to Himself so they could be for His renown and praise and honor. When modern readers encounter those words, we often imagine a demanding king requiring endless applause from his subjects. We think of religious performance. But in the context of an intimate garment, the meaning shifts completely. A beautiful, pristine linen sash brings honor.